Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Nick. I wanted to come to you today for our Wednesday Bible study from the book of 1 Samuel. So I want to invite you to turn in your Bible there to 1 Samuel chapter 8. As you do that, just a couple of announcements. In the comments section of Facebook, where this video is going to be posted, are going to be prayer requests, some of which I've amassed over the last few days. And I want to encourage you to add some to there so that others can be praying for you and for other circumstances as well. I am feeling better, so I'm glad to be back in the office today and to be able to join you virtually here. But as always, look forward to Sunday and getting to see you all and to be with you all. So those are precious times, and when you miss, like I had to last week, it's no fun. But God is good, and we're going to see His grace today in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So let's, since it's been a little while, it feels like anyway, since we have come together for this study, let me catch you up a little bit. Samuel is the judge here in 1 Samuel 8 over all of Israel. He was appointed by God, chosen by God for this role. He grew up sort of in the house of the Lord, as it were, and so we're entering now in 1 Samuel 8 into the maturing part of Samuel's ministry. He's an old man now. We have seen his judgeship take place, and as the text is going to reveal to us as we read it, his sons have been appointed, not by God, but by Samuel, to help judge Israel as well. And that's going to be the source of some problems, as you can imagine. So let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. Let's just look at the first 5 verses to begin with. And it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. So we sort of have a meeting taking place here. Samuel's older, and in his old age, he wants his sons to be able to help out in his work. But Samuel, remember, has a very unique work that was appointed by God even before he was born. And so Samuel has gone to the lengths, and we would think it almost reasonable. You need help, have your sons help you. But in reality, this was probably a tactical mistake by Samuel. What do we think of when we think of a hereditary judgeship? We think of Eli, remember? Eli's sons were scoundrels to the people. They stole. Here, Samuel's sons were perverting justice and took bribes and were gaining financially with great dishonesty. So it was not a good situation for Samuel, and so the elders are recognizing this. That is, some of the older men here in Israel, and they gather with a meeting at Ramah where Samuel lives. Verse 5 says this, "They said to him, 'Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations.'" So if we see Samuel making a mistake, and we're going to see more evidence of that, we're also finding Israel making a mistake. In their attempt to correct a problem that they see, they are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What they're saying is, we're going to reject the judgeship of Israel. And the judgeship, you remember even in the book of Judges, the Lord would raise up from time to time judges who will not rule over Israel, but almost govern, if I can put it that way. God still ruled, Yahweh still ruled as the king, but the judge would have been God's human authority in that sense. He would do the things that God would want him to do. And so there was a much more intimate relationship before 1 Samuel chapter 8 between the Lord and his people. But chapter 8 represents, for lack of a better word, Israel breaking up with God, if I can put it that way. Because what they're doing now is they're rejecting what God has established with respect to the judges. Gideon actually, interestingly enough, he was a judge. If you go back to Judges chapter 8, you'll find this statement by Gideon that when people suggested that he appoint his sons to his judgeship, almost like a hereditary thing, Gideon rejected it because he knew that wasn't part of God's plan. And Samuel, of course, did not reject that, tried to set something like that up, whether intentionally or not. It just did not work. But the people of Israel overreacted too. Instead of saying to Samuel, listen, this is what your sons are doing. You remember Eli and that circumstance, that did not work out well. So why don't you just remove your sons from that? That would have been probably a more amenable approach, but they didn't do that. They said, you know what? We're going to reject the whole office of the judgeship, and we want a king. Specifically in verse 5, they say, now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. And this is probably what sort of got at the heart of God, is that God's people wanted to be like the world. And in so doing, they are rejecting God and his provision and the way that he set things up. Look at verses 6 through 9. The thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel. You could imagine. It's almost like a personal rejection. Samuel, we like you. Your sons are scoundrels, but we just think we're going to go in a different direction. All right, so you can imagine the sense of personal rejection that Samuel's feeling. Of course, it led him to seek the Lord. Verse 6 says, when they said, give us a king to judge us, Samuel prayed to the Lord. So first thing he knows how to do is he seeks after the will of the Lord. And in verse 7, this is what the Lord said to Samuel. He said, listen to the voice of the people. Maybe not what he wanted to hear right off. But he said, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. As much as Samuel was displeased and feeling maybe bad about himself, look how the Lord steps in to comfort Samuel. He says, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And rejected specifically the Lord from being king over them. Because at this point, the Lord is seen as the king. Yahweh is seen as their great God, the one true and living God. He is the king of Israel. And Israel decides they want not God as king, but one of themselves as king. Verse 8 says, like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. So here Samuel just opens up for us this narration, just opens up God's heart. And the Lord is recounting his relationship with Israel ever since the time of Egypt, when he delivered them from centuries of bondage, of slavery. And here they come into the desert, and what do? They build a golden calf, or they have other gods. We see all throughout the part of the book of Judges, especially, people are just so fickle. They swing to God when it's convenient, and they swing another way when it's not convenient to be with the Lord. And so the Lord is feeling this sense of cyclical betrayal by Israel. And in verse 8, when the Lord is telling all this to Samuel and recounting, I brought them out of Egypt even to this day, but yet they have forsaken me, and they have served other gods. And he says, so they're doing to you also. So here the Lord helps Samuel to feel a little bit of what the Lord is feeling. They're both feeling rejected in that way. Verse 9 says, Now then listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. So the Lord is going to relent. He's going to let them do what they want, perhaps as an exercise of judgment. But we're going to see here. This is interesting what follows. The Lord gives Samuel a word to tell the people, sort of a final word. If you're going to go this way, then this is what you can expect. And so verses 10 through 18, the Lord gives Samuel, and Samuel conveys it to the people, what they can expect of a human king. Verse 11 says, This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. Remember, one of the reasons the elders, when they gathered with Samuel together, is that they wanted to be like the other nations. You see, the other nations around had kings and armies and great pomp and circumstance and parade and all these sorts of things. And Israel grew fond of the things of the world. Because up until this point, the Lord, as king, has been the one who has fought for Israel. And who better to fight for Israel than the Lord himself? But yet the people get in their heads their ideas that this is not a good thing, because they can't see the Lord manifestly with their eyes. They can't perceive the Lord with their senses, but yet they can see what their neighbors are doing, and they can see the ways of the world, and those become very attractive to Israel. Instead of relying and trusting God by faith, that God has this under control. How often have we done that? How often have we rejected God's provision and his way for us in favor of something else that looks more attractive, something that the world has manufactured for us? I bet if we think about that long and hard, we can probably think of examples in our lives where even in our testimonies, we have rejected God in favor of the world. But what he tells Samuel to tell the people is that as the king will reign over you, this human king, he will take your sons. Because what do kings do? How do kings establish their authority? With an army, with a battalion, with great might. He said one of the first things you're going to pay for is the blood of your sons, as this king will lead you into war with this army. Verse 12, and he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Chariots were sort of the armored tanks of the day. And he warns them that this is what's going to happen. You will lose loved ones because you wanted a king that was human instead of a king that was God. He puts it very bluntly in that way. Verse 13, he says, he will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. Have you ever thought what it takes to establish a monarchy, a kingship? It's going to take a lot of people away from their families. It's going to take a lot of taxes, a lot of expense to maintain a monarchy, to maintain a king in that sense. And so he warns them, this is what you're getting into. Verse 14, he says, he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. All right, so there's also going to be a sense of servitude here in the kingdom. They're going to have a kind of slavery. They're going to have a professional army Verse 16 says, he will take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. All right, in other words, he's going to tax you through these things in a way that you're not going to like. And God, being very gracious, gives Samuel the warning to give to the people. He gives them this in all disclosure. Verse 18 says, then you will cry out in that day because your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. In other words, the Lord is saying, you will regret one day. And when you come to me, I'm not going to do anything about it. So it's quite a blunt statement from the Lord. Verses 19 through the end of the chapter here indicate this. The people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel after Samuel told them. They said, no, but there shall be a king over us. They had in their minds this idea that a human king was going to be better. They're not thinking about the costs. They're thinking about some sort of the way we would think about instant gratification. That there is virtue in delayed gratification. And we can apply that to all sorts of parts of our lives. But they wanted a king, and they wanted a king now. They didn't care what it costs. They weren't thinking straight. They were thinking like the world instead of thinking and seeking after the mind of the Lord. Verse 20 says that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. They're thinking a king and a professional army are going to fight their battles for them. In the past, it was always the Lord who had directed them. It was the Lord, through the judge, directed the people. And the Lord miraculously worked so many times in the life of Israel, even to the point where not a single Israelite was killed in some of these battles. The Lord was powerful enough to do that. But what Israel is doing is they're rejecting God's power. They're rejecting the testimony of God and what he has done over and over and over for them. And they want to be what? Like the world. Like the world. You can imagine how frustrated Samuel is, or even the Lord is. Verse 21 says, now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice, appoint them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So when the Lord said that to Samuel, all right, just now, so the Lord spoke to Samuel, said, tell the people this. The people tell Samuel this. Samuel goes back to the Lord. This is what the people said. And then in verse 22 is probably a judgment upon the people by God. And he said, listen to their voice and appoint them a king. Give them what they want. And what we're going to find is that they will be sorry in the long run. And he gives Samuel the interesting job to appoint a king and to give them a king. So we're going to see how that works out. Yes, the Lord will anoint the king in this way. We're going to see Saul become king first, and then David, Solomon, so on and so forth. The Lord will anoint the kings, and he'll still work through the kings and work through to achieve his purposes. But just notice this episode here is very much a turning point in God's relationship with his people. So I want to encourage you today, as we try to apply this passage to our lives, is to challenge you and to think through some of the ways that we reject God, maybe unintentionally. I want to challenge you today to seek after the Lord and let him show you perhaps ways that you have rejected him, ways in which you have favored the world's ways over ours. Think of it in the terms of seeing people come to know Christ. Are we relying on the scriptures and God's Spirit to regenerate people? Or are we trying to manufacture decisions? Is our confidence no longer in the scriptures? There's just some different ways that we can challenge ourselves to think about and to obey God in this way. So thank you all for your attention. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next Lord's Day.